The whole compound was laughing at Adaise because she had just knelt in the rain to feed a dying stranger the last food in the house. And her aunt was already shouting that a girl who wasted bread on beggars deserved to starve like one. What none of them knew, what not one laughing mouth in that courtyard could have guessed, was that the ragged man, eating from her hands, would walk back into their lives 3 months later, wearing the coral beads of a chief, and that he had come looking for the exact girl they were mocking. It was the worst rain of the season, and the man had fallen at the gate just before dusk. He was tall under the dirt, but the dirt was all anyone saw. His shirt was torn at the shoulder and stained the color of the road. His feet were bare and split, and his cheeks had caved in the way a man's cheeks cave when he has not eaten in days. He did not beg. That was the thing Adaise would remember later. He only lifted his eyes to the lantern in the doorway and asked, in a voice almost gone, whether there was any water. Mama Nkechi reached the doorway first. She was a wide, hard woman in an emerald green lace blouse, with gold in her ears and a carved cane in her fist. And she looked at the man as though a strayed dog had wandered too close to her cooking. She told him to take his curse somewhere else. She said this house had no food for the dead, and that he had clearly come to the wrong gate, because nobody here was foolish enough to feed a stranger who would only bring bad luck behind him. Behind her, the cousins gathered to watch. Chinyere came to the door in her bright fuchsia wrapper, fanning herself, and her 2 friends came with her. And the 3 of them looked down at the man in the rain and began to laugh. They laughed as only well-fed people laugh at hunger, as if it were a thing that happened to other, lesser people, a thing you could catch by standing too close. Chinyere said something about how even the beggars in this district had no shame anymore, and her friends laughed harder, and the man on the ground lowered his head and breathed and said nothing at all. Adaise was at the back of the house when she heard it. She came forward with her hands still damp from washing, a slender girl of 24 in a faded marigold wrapper, a rust headscarf tied over her hair, scuffed brown slippers on her feet. She was the niece they kept like a tool, useful and unpaid, and she had learned long ago to make herself small. But when she saw the man's split feet and his caved-in face, something in her would not stay small. She did not argue with her aunt. She had learned that arguing only made the cane come down faster. Instead, she slipped back into the kitchen, and she looked at what was there, and there was almost nothing there. There was a little Gary, and there was a single wrap of stockfish she had been saving, and there was the cold remainder of the morning's yam. She took all of it. She made a bowl with her own hands, and she carried it out into the rain, and she knelt down on the wet mud brick in front of the whole laughing courtyard, and she held it out to him. Her aunt's voice cracked across the yard like the cane itself. Mama Nkechi said that if Adaise gave that food away, she would not eat for 2 days, and that she could explain to her dead mother why she chose a roadside beggar over her own stomach. Chinyere laughed and said the maid had finally found a husband her own size. And still Adaise did not move, did not lower the bowl, did not look away from the man's face. She only said quietly that nobody died in front of her while there was food in the house. And she pressed the bowl into his shaking hands. If you have ever watched someone good be treated as nothing, watched the world write off a gentle soul and quietly, fiercely wished to see that soul proven right, then you already understand why this channel exists, and you already belong here. Take one moment to subscribe, because the people who stay for stories like Adaise's are exactly the people these stories are for. And what God is about to do with one bowl of food and one folded dress is the part I have been waiting to tell you. He ate the way a starving man eats, too fast and then ashamed of how fast. And she steadied the bowl for him so it would not spill. When he had finished, he looked up at her, and his eyes were clear and dark and far too steady for a beggar's. though she was too tired to notice that then. He asked her name. She told him. He repeated it once, softly, like a man committing something to memory. Then her aunt drove her inside, and the rain swallowed the rest. That night, lying on her thin mat with her belly empty as promised, Adais did not feel like a fool. She felt what she always felt after she had done the one thing she could still call her own. Her aunt had taken her dead father's house. Her cousin had taken the bedroom that should have been hers. They had taken her time, her work, her name in front of guests. But they had never managed to take the thing her mother had pressed into her before she died, which was simply this: that you did not let a person suffer in front of you if you had it in your power to ease them, no matter who was laughing. Because the stranger did not leave the next morning as her aunt expected. He was too weak to walk, and even Mama Nkechi would not throw a half-dead man into the road where the village elders might see. So she put him in the goat shed at the back and told Adeze that since the girl loved beggars so much, she could nurse this one herself, on her own time, with her own hands. It was meant as a punishment. Adeze took it as the only kindness the house had offered her in months. So for the better part of a week, she tended him. She brought him water and what little food she could spare from her own portion. She cleaned the cut on his shoulder with salt and warm water until it closed. She washed the road out of his one good shirt and laid it on the fence to dry. And she talked to him, because he was the first person in that compound who listened when she spoke. He told her his name was Obinna. He told her he had been traveling and had been robbed of everything on the road, which was true as far as it went, and was very far indeed from the whole of it. What he did not tell her was that he was the only son of the late Chief Okonkwo, master of the largest estate 3 valleys over, a man who owned land in 4 districts and a white Lexus that the village children would have followed for a mile. He did not tell her that he had walked out of that estate in rags on purpose, with nothing in his pockets, because he was sick to his soul of women who smiled at his name and his cars and never once at him. He had decided, against all his late mother's advice, to go out into the country as a poor man and see, with his own eyes, whether kindness still lived in any house that did not first ask what he was worth. He had been turned from 11 gates before he reached Adese's. Hers was the first that opened. He watched her those days the way a thirsty man watches rain. He saw how she was spoken to. He saw how her aunt's cane hovered, how her cousin took the best of everything and left Adais the scraps, how the girl was made to scrub the floor of a house her own father had built. He saw, too, that she never once complained of it to him, that she gave him the larger share of her own small food and told him she was not hungry when her stomach said otherwise. He saw a girl who had been given nothing and who still gave. And somewhere in that goat shed, eating yam from the hands of a servant the world despised, the disguised son of Chief Okonkwo found exactly the thing he had walked out of his estate to find. There was one evening in that week she would come back to many times. The fever had left him, and he was sitting up against the shed wall in the last of the light. And she had brought him a little soup and sat a while, because the house had no more tasks for her until morning. He asked her that evening why she had fed him when her own family forbade it and her own stomach was empty. She thought about it, turning the question over as she might turn a length of cloth to find its grain. And then she told him about her mother, and the needle, and the creed, and how a small person answers the world by giving more than a small person can afford. He was quiet for a long time after that. He looked at her in the dim light as if he were memorizing her, and he said, almost to himself, that he had traveled a very long way to hear someone say a thing like that and mean it. She did not understand what he meant. She thought it was only the talk of a man still weak with hunger. It was, in fact, the moment a chief decided his whole life. He stayed a day longer than he needed to. Then, on the 7th morning, he was gone. He left at dawn while the compound slept, and he left no message because the message he intended to leave could not be spoken yet. But before he went, he stood a long moment over the one thing in that house that was truly hers, the one good thing she owned, and his jaw tightened. And he made himself a promise that the whole village would one day be forced to witness. That one good thing was a dress. It was a marigold and rust Ankara wrapper, the only fine cloth Adès possessed, sewn by her own hands from a length her mother had bought in the last good year before the sickness took her. Adès had stitched every seam of it on the old treadle machine in the corner of the back room, working by lamplight after the household slept. And when it was finished, it had been beautiful, the kind of dress a girl saves for the one day in her life that might be hers. She kept it folded in cloth at the bottom of a small wooden trunk, and on the hardest nights she would lift the lid only to look at it, to remember that she had once made something whole. She did not know that Obinna had seen it. She did not know that on the morning he left, he had opened that trunk while she slept and looked at the folded dress and understood, in a single glance, exactly what it was and exactly what it cost her. She did not know any of that yet. She only knew that the goat shed was empty, that the strange gentleman was gone as the rain goes, leaving nothing behind it but wet ground, and that the compound went back to treating her like furniture before the dew had dried. The weeks that followed were hard, even by the measure of that house. The harmattan came, dry and red, and with it came illness. Adaizi's younger brother, the only blood she had left in the world, a boy of 9 named Chukwudi, who lived with a distant cousin 2 compounds over, fell sick with a fever that would not break. The cousin sent word that there was no money for the clinic, that the boy was burning, that if something was not done, the fever would take him as it had taken so many that dry season. And Adès, who had nothing, who was paid nothing, who owned nothing in all the world but the clothes she stood in, and one folded dress at the bottom of a trunk, knew at once what she would have to do. She went to her aunt first, because that was right. Because Mama Nkechi held what little money the household had, and the boy was her late brother's son too. She knelt and she asked, humbly, for help for Chukwudi. Mama Nkechi did not even look up from counting her market change. She said the boy was not her problem, that she had her own daughter's future to think of, and that if Adès wanted to play the saint, she could pay for it out of her own pocket, which they both knew was empty. Then she said the thing that decided it. She said that a girl with nothing should learn to let go of things, because nothing was all she would ever have. So Adès went to the trunk. She lifted the lid in the gray morning light, and she took out the folded marigold dress, the one good thing she owned, the dress she had saved for a wedding day she had long stopped believing would come. She held it for a moment against her chest. Then she wrapped it in clean cloth, tucked it under her arm, and walked the long, dusty road to the market to sell it. The market was loud and bright and indifferent. She moved through the crowded stalls with the bundle held tight, past the tomatoes and the dried fish and the traders calling under their faded umbrellas, asking quietly at the cloth sellers whether anyone would buy a fine dress, hardly worn. They turned it over in their hard hands and named cruel prices because they could see in her face how badly she needed the money. And a seller who can see your need will always offer you less. In the end, a woman who sold second-hand clothes gave her a price that was an insult to the work in every seam. And Adaizi took it because Chukwudi was burning and there was no time to bargain with her pride. She did not go home. She carried the few crumpled notes straight to the cousin's compound, and she put them in the cousin's hands, and she stood over the boy and bathed his forehead and prayed the low, fierce prayers her mother had taught her until the clinic could be reached. And by the grace of God, or by the simple mercy of medicine bought in time, the fever broke 2 nights later. Chukwudi lived. The dress was gone. Adaeze counted it a fair trade and did not let herself weep until she was alone on the road home. And even then she wept quietly, the same quiet she brought to everything. When she returned to the compound, her aunt and her cousin found out what she had done, and they did not pity her for it. They mocked her. Mama Nkechi laughed a dry, satisfied laugh, and said she had always known the girl was a fool, that only a fool sells her last good thing for a child who is not even worth a goat's ransom. Chinyere was crueler still. She said, in front of her friends, that the maid had sold her wedding dress, and that it hardly mattered, since no man was ever going to marry a dry stick like Adaeze anyway, dress or no dress. The 2 friends laughed their bright, cruel laughs, and one of them gave Adaeze the name that would follow her for weeks. She called her the beggar's bride, because the only man who had ever looked twice at her was the dying stranger she had fed. And they all knew, the whole compound agreed, that a beggar's bride was all she would ever be. Adaeze carried the name as she carried every other burden, in silence, with her back straight. But the empty place at the bottom of her trunk was a wound she did not show anyone. Some nights she would lift the lid out of old habit and find nothing folded there, only the bare wood, and she would close it again and breathe and remind herself that a sick boy was alive because of that emptiness. It did not make the emptiness smaller. It only made it bearable. To understand why Adaeze gave the way she gave, you had to know where she had learned it. And she had learned it from a woman the village had also once underestimated. Her mother had been a seamstress before her, the finest in that whole district, a woman who could look at a length of cloth and see the dress already living inside it. She had not been rich. A seamstress in a poor village is never rich. But she had been respected, and she had been kind, and she had raised her daughter at her knee with 2 things only, a needle and a creed. The needle she taught Adaeze to use until the girl could sew a seam so fine you could not find where it began. The creed she taught her was simpler still, and harder. She used to say, threading the lamp-lit needle, that the measure of a person was never what they had in their hands, but what they were willing to put into someone else's. She used to say that the world would always try to teach Adaeze that she was small, and that the only answer to it was to refuse quietly, by giving more than a small person could afford. And then the sickness had come, in the year after the one good year, and taken her, and left her daughter to a brother's wife who saw the needle and the creed and valued neither. So when Adaeze sewed, she was not only sewing. She was keeping her mother alive in the only place she still could, in the steadiness of her own 2 hands. The marigold dress had been the proof of it, the one whole beautiful thing she had made, sewn from her mother's last length of cloth by the same lamp her mother had worked under. And that was why selling it had cost so much more than the coins it brought. It was not a dress she had given to the market. It was the last thing her mother's hands had touched that she could still hold. And she had given even that, for a sick boy who could not repay her, because a small person who refuses to be small does not count the cost first. Her mother would have done the same. Her mother had done the same 100 times. In 100 quiet ways the village had long forgotten. Kindness in that bloodline was not a feeling. It was a discipline, passed hand to hand, like the threading of a needle in poor light. What Adaeze could not know, kneeling at the bottom of that house, was that 3 valleys away, a very different conversation was taking place. In the great whitewashed mansion of the Okonkwo estate, the disguised man she had nursed back to life had become himself again. The rags were burned. Obinna stood now in gold-embroidered red isiagu, the coral beads of his late father at his throat, the master of all of it. And he was telling his mother's old confidant, the elderly aunt who ran his household, that he had found her at last. He had found the woman he meant to marry. A seamstress, he said. A girl who had fed him when he had nothing, who had given away her own food and called it no sacrifice, who did not know his name, and had never once asked what he owned. The household thought he had lost his mind. They asked who her people were, what her family was worth. He only smiled and said that her worth was the one thing in that whole region not for sale. And then the wheels of the story, which had been turning quietly all along, locked into place in a way nobody in Adeze's compound could yet see. Because Mama Nkechi, hungry as ever for status, had been working for months to push her own daughter upward into money. She had heard, as the whole region had heard, that the young master of the Okonkwo estate had returned from his long absence and was finally looking to take a wife. She had heard that he was rich beyond reckoning, that he was unmarried, that his late mother's people were quietly putting out word among the better families that the chief's son would soon choose a bride. And Mama Nkechi had decided, with the cold certainty of a woman who has never once doubted her own daughter's beauty, that the bride would be Chinyere. She spared no expense she could not afford. She borrowed against the next harvest. She sent Chinyere to the estate's gatherings dressed like a queen, paraded her at every function where the chief's household might be watching, spread word through every aunt and matchmaker in 4 districts that her daughter was available, well-bred, and the most beautiful girl in the valley. She bought a coral bead bridal set on credit. She let the whole compound know that a great marriage was coming, that the days of scraping were nearly over, that soon the family name would be joined to the Okonkwo name and they would never have to bow to anyone again. And in all of it, not once, not for a single moment, did she imagine that the chief she was chasing and the beggar her despised niece had fed were the same living man. If you have made it this far into Adeze's story, hit subscribe, because what happens next is the part I have been waiting to tell you. The word came on a Tuesday, carried by a breathless matchmaker who had run the last stretch of road. The chief had chosen. Of all the families in all 4 districts, the Okonkwo household had sent formal word that their son would come in person to take a bride from Mama Nkechi's compound. The matchmaker did not have every detail, only that the young master himself had named this house, that he was coming with his elders and his gifts and his white vehicle, and that the wedding was to be held here, in this very courtyard, within the month. Mama Nkechi sat down hard on her stool and pressed her hand to her chest and, for the first time in living memory, wept for joy. She had no doubt at all who he was coming for. He had named her compound, and her compound held exactly one marriageable beauty, and that beauty was Chinyere. The aunt was as certain of it as she was of the sunrise. She took it as proof that all her scheming had finally borne fruit, that the months of borrowing and parading and boasting had reached the ears of the great house and moved the chief to choose her daughter's sight by report. She did not stop to wonder why a man that rich would name a compound this poor. She did not let herself wonder anything that might spoil the joy. She simply began to plan the largest wedding the village had ever seen, on money she did not have, for a marriage she did not understand. What Mama Nkechi could not know, what the audience by now had begun to guess, was the truth that recontextualized everything that had passed in that courtyard. The chief who had named her compound had not chosen Chinyere at all. He had walked the villages in rags precisely so that no woman would be chosen for her father's name or her mother's scheming. He had named that compound for one reason only, because it was the one gate in 11 that had opened to a dying stranger. Because somewhere inside its walls lived a seamstress in a faded marigold wrapper who had given him her food, and though he did not yet know the whole of it, her last good dress. Obinna was not coming to marry the proud daughter the village admired. He was coming for the despised niece the village mocked. And the cruelest, sweetest part of it was that he had let the formal word go out the ordinary way, naming only the house and not the girl, so that the proud would have time to gather and dress and assemble the whole laughing village in one courtyard before he revealed which woman in it he had actually come to claim. But none of that was visible yet from inside the compound. And so the household gave itself over to a frenzy of preparation that fell, as everything always fell, on Adaise's back. There was cooking to be done for hundreds, and Adaise did it. There were floors to scrub and walls to whitewash and a courtyard to clear and decorate, and Adaise did all of it, on her knees, from before dawn to past dark. While Chinyere reclined and was fitted and refitted for her bridal regalia. The cruelty of those weeks had a particular flavor. It was not enough that Adaise should serve. She had to serve at the celebration of the very life that had been denied her. She had to sew, with her own clever hands, parts of the bridal outfit that her cousin would wear to marry a rich man, while the household reminded her daily that no rich man would ever come for a beggar's bride like her. Chinyere made certain of that. She had Adaise brought into the room while she was being dressed, just to watch, just so the maid could see what a real bride looked like. She turned in front of the borrowed mirror in her new coral beads and her gold-threaded lace, and she asked Adaise sweetly whether she had ever in her life imagined wearing something so fine, and then answered the question herself before Adaise could speak. Of course she had not, Chinyere said. Girls like Adaise were born to dress girls like Chinyere, and that was simply the order of the world, and there was no shame in knowing your place so long as you kept to it. Her friends, who came every day now to help and to gossip, laughed and called Adaise the beggar's bride again, and asked whether her own husband, the roadside beggar, would be coming to the wedding too, and whether he would arrive on foot or be carried. Adaise bore it. She had a great deal of practice in bearing things. But there was one wound in those weeks that went deeper than the rest, and it had nothing to do with Chinyere's tongue. It was that, more and more, in the long hours of scrubbing and stitching, she found herself thinking of Obinna, of the gentle, ruined man she had fed in the rain, of the steadiness in his eyes that had not matched his rags, of how he had said her name once, softly, as if it were worth keeping, and then vanished at dawn without a word. She did not know what had become of him. She told herself he was probably dead in some ditch, or had moved on to some other gate, and that a girl who had sold her wedding dress for a sick child had no business dreaming about a beggar who had not even said goodbye. But the heart does what it does. And on the nights when the house was loudest with wedding talk, it was Obinna's quiet face she saw before she slept, and the seeing of it hurt more than the cane ever had. She did not let the hurt make her bitter. That was the strange, stubborn grace in her that the chief had seen the household never would. Even now, even broken to the floor of her father's house, she did not curse her cousin or wish the wedding to fail. When a poor old woman came to the back gate one evening, hungry, while the courtyard blazed with lamps and wealth, Adaise did exactly what she had done for the stranger in the rain. She slipped the old woman the food off her own plate and sent her away fed, and asked nothing for it, and told no one. She did not do it to be seen. There was no one watching. or so she thought. She did it because it was the one thing they had never managed to take from her. And she would have done it if the whole world were laughing. And the whole world very nearly was. 2 days before the wedding, Mama Nkechi made the household's contempt official. She gathered everyone in the courtyard and laid out, like a general, where each person would stand when the great chief arrived. Chinyere would be at the center, of course, beneath the decorated canopy, in her full bridal regalia, ready to be claimed. The aunt herself would stand at the front to receive the chief's elders. The friends would attend the bride. And Adaze, she said, would stay out of sight. She was to remain at the very back, near the cooking fires, in her faded wrapper. And on no account was she to come forward where the great family might see her and judge the whole household by the look of its lowest servant. She was the shame of the family, Mama Nkechi said plainly. And on the day of the family's triumph, the shame would be kept where it belonged. Chinyere smiled. The friends laughed, and Adaze lowered her head and said, "Yes, Auntie," and went back to the fires, and did not let a single one of them see her face. The last night before the wedding was the longest of Adaeze's life. The compound did not sleep. There was cooking that ran until the small hours, great pots of jollof and pepper soup and pounded yam. And it was Adaeze who tended the fires while the bride slept, and the aunt counted the borrowed finery for the 10th time. Out at the back, alone with the flames in the dark, Adaeze let herself feel, just once, the full weight of what tomorrow would be. Tomorrow she would watch her cousin marry into a life of ease while she carried the dishes. Tomorrow the great family would come, and she would be hidden by the cooking fires like a thing to be ashamed of. And a rich man she would never meet would take away the one girl in the compound the village had always preferred. She did not begrudge Chinyere the marriage. She had given up begrudging anyone anything a long time ago. But she let herself grieve, quietly, by the fire. For the wedding she would never have, and the dress she had sold to save a child, and the gentle stranger who had said her name once, and then walked out of the world. Then she wiped her face, and she banked the coals, and she went on with the work. Because grief, in that house, was a luxury she was not allowed to keep for long. 3 valleys away, in the great house, that same night ran very differently and toward the very same dawn. The elders of the Okonkwo family were uneasy. They could not understand why their young master, who could have married into the wealthiest house in the region, who had 100 well-born girls and their mothers angling for his name, insisted on going to a poor compound to take a servant for his wife. They argued with him. They reminded him of his father's standing, of what was owed to the family's dignity, of how the better families would talk. Obinna heard them out. And then he told them, simply, that he had spent his whole life among people who loved his name, and none who loved him, and that he had finally met the only person in the world who had loved him when he was nothing, and that he intended to spend the rest of his life proving he had been worth her kindness. He had the marigold dress brought out and shown to them, the dress he had bought back from the market, and he told them what it had cost the girl who sold it. After that, the elders fell quiet. Some of them, the old ones who remembered what poverty was, looked at the folded cloth a long time, and one of them said that the boy had chosen better than any of them had known how to. They went into the wedding day. Then, with 2 households marching toward one courtyard, each certain of a completely different ending, and only the chief and the audience knowing which one was true, the wedding day came up hot and bright and cloudless. The Harmattan haze burned away to a high blue, as if the sky itself had dressed for the occasion. By mid-morning, the compound was unrecognizable. Cloth canopies in red and gold had been raised over the courtyard. Rows of chairs stood in the swept earth. Drummers warmed their skins in the shade, and long tables sagged under more food than that household had seen in a year, every dish of it cooked by a days's hands. The guests came in their hundreds, the whole village and half the district besides, in their brightest Ankara and their finest lace and their heaviest coral, because everyone wanted to witness the poor woman's daughter married to the richest man in the land. Cinieri sat enthroned beneath the central canopy in her full bridal regalia, magnificent and cold, the coral bead crown on her brow, the gold-threaded wrapper arranged just so, her face fixed in the serene triumph of a woman about to receive everything she believed she was owed. Mama Nkechi stood at the front in her emerald lace, her cane planted like a staff of office, scanning the road for the first sign of the chief's vehicle. The friends fluttered around the bride, and far at the back, near the smoking cooking fires, in her faded marigold-colored wrapper and her rust headscarf, kept out of sight exactly as she had been ordered, stood Ades, watching the celebration of a life that should have been hers, and quietly wishing her cousin happiness despite it all. Then the sound came that silenced the drums, an engine, low and smooth, of a kind that road had rarely heard. The crowd surged toward the gate, and through the rising dust came a white luxury SUV, gleaming, immaculate, the sun flashing off its polished flank. And behind it, a second vehicle, and behind that, the elders of the great Okonkwo house in their richest attire. The whole courtyard rose to its feet. Mama Nkechi's face shone with a joy so complete it was almost holy. Cinieri lifted her chin and arranged her hands and prepared to be chosen. The white vehicle rolled to a stop at the edge of the canopies, and the dust settled. And for one long, breathless moment, nothing moved at all. The door opened, and the man who stepped out into the sunlight was a chief in the fullness of his power, tall and broad-shouldered in gold-embroidered red Isiagu, the great coral beads of his late father heavy at his throat, a matching coral cap upon his head, dignified and calm and utterly commanding. The crowd gasped and then fell to murmuring, because here was wealth made flesh. Here was the answer to every prayer Mama Nkechi had ever sent up. He stood a moment beside his vehicle and let his eyes move slowly across the assembled courtyard, across the canopies and the drummers and the hundreds of staring faces, taking it all in. And not one person in that whole vast crowd recognized him. Not the aunt who had cursed him from her doorway. Not the cousin who had laughed at him in the rain. They had only ever seen the dirt. They had never once seen the man. Mama Nkechi hurried forward, bowing, her voice thick with welcome, and began to present her daughter. She gestured grandly toward the canopy where Cinieri sat in her bridal crown, naming her the most beautiful girl in 4 districts, the bride the great chief had so wisely chosen. Cinieri rose and stepped forward with a triumphant smile, advancing toward him with her hands outstretched, ready to take her place at his side before the whole admiring world. It was the moment the entire scheme had been built toward. It was the moment everything turned, because the chief did not look at Cinieri. His gaze passed over the bride in her coral crown as though she were one more decoration in the courtyard, and traveled on, past the aunt, past the friends, past the rows of staring guests, all the way to the back of the compound, to the cooking fires, to a slender girl in a faded marigold wrapper who had been kept out of sight. And his calm face changed. Something in it softened and steadied at once, the way a traveler's face changes when a long road finally ends. He left the aunt mid-sentence. He stepped around the outstretched, faltering hands of the bride, and to the absolute astonishment of every soul present, the richest man in the land walked the full length of that courtyard, through the parting, murmuring crowd, straight toward the servant girl at the fires. Adès did not understand at first what was happening. She saw the great chief coming toward her, and she stepped back, certain there was some mistake. Certain she was about to be scolded for being seen, glancing around for somewhere to disappear. And then he was standing before her, close enough that she could see his face beneath the coral cap. And the breath went out of her, because she knew that face. She had cleaned the cut on its shoulder. She had fed its hunger from her own hands in the rain. The eyes that had been too steady for a beggar's looked down at her now from beneath a chief's crown. And they were the same eyes, and they were full. And the gentle, ruined stranger she had nursed and mourned and dreamed of was standing in front of the whole village, dressed as what he had been all along. The courtyard had gone utterly silent. Even the drummers had frozen. And into that silence, the chief turned and faced the crowd. And he lifted his voice so that every guest, every elder, every laughing mouth that had ever mocked her could hear, and he told them who he was and what had happened. He told them that some weeks past he had walked their roads as a poor man, robbed and starving, to find out whether kindness still lived anywhere that did not first count his money. He told them that 11 gates had turned him away to die. And he told them that one gate, this very compound, had opened, and that the girl who opened it had given him her own food while her family laughed, and had nursed him back to life with her own hands, and had never once asked his name or his worth. Then he reached into the folds of his regalia, and he drew out something folded and worn, and he held it up high above his head for the whole courtyard to see. And a sound went through the crowd, like wind through dry grass. It was the marigold dress. Her dress, the one good thing she had owned, the one she had sold in the market to save a sick child, the very cloth her hands had sewn by lamplight. He had bought it back. He had found the second-hand seller in the market and bought it back the same week he left. And he had carried it with him ever since, wrapped in clean cloth. And now he held it over his head before them all. He said that this was the dress this woman had sold, so that a dying boy who was not even her own could live. And that any village that called such a woman a beggar's bride did not know the difference between what was poor and what was precious. The effect upon Mama Nkechi and her daughter was the slow, terrible understanding of people watching their whole world come apart in front of an audience. Chinyeri stood frozen in the center of the courtyard, in her coral crown and her gold-threaded lace, her outstretched hands still half raised toward a man who had walked past her as if she were not there, and the triumph drained out of her face and left it gray. She looked at the dress held high above the crowd, and she looked at the servant cousin she had mocked every day of her life. And she understood, all at once and far too late, that the beggar she had laughed at in the rain and the chief she had been promised were the same man, and that the man had come for Adès. The cane slipped in Mama Nkechi's grip. The aunt's mouth opened and closed and made no sound. The bridal regalia they had borrowed against the harvest, the schemes, the boasting, the cruelty, all of it turned to ash in a single afternoon, in front of every neighbor whose respect they had spent years demanding, and the chorus of laughing friends who had coined the name, who had called her the beggar's bride and asked whether her husband would arrive on foot, fell silent and small. One of them began, uselessly, to back away into the crowd. There was nowhere for any of them to put their faces. The whole village had heard the name they gave her. The whole village now watched it become a crown. Obinna turned back to Adès. The hard public voice was gone. What was left was the gentle man from the goat shed. He folded the marigold dress with care and pressed it back into her trembling hands where it belonged. And he told her, quietly, only for her, that he had searched for her since the morning he left, that he had not been able to forget the one gate that opened, that a man who owned 4 districts had finally found the one thing he could not buy and did not want to live without. Then, before the elders and the drummers and the hundreds of silent guests, the master of the Okonkwo estate went down and asked the servant girl in the faded wrapper to be his wife. Adais wept. She had not wept in front of them through all the cruelty, through the cane and the scrubbing and the name. But she wept now, with the folded dress against her chest and the gentle man kneeling before her, and the whole crowd wept with her. Because there is something in a true reversal that breaks even hard hearts open. She said yes. Of course she said yes. And the drummers, freed at last, struck up such a sound as that courtyard had never held. And the village that had come to celebrate a proud woman's triumph found itself instead celebrating a humble one's. And somehow the celebration was greater for it. But the deepest measure of who Adaize was came in what she did next. And it was the very thing the chief had crossed 3 valleys to find. She did not gloat. She had every right to. The cousin who had tormented her stood humiliated an arm's length away. The aunt who had cursed her was undone before the whole district, and Adaize held all their futures in her hand now, for she was about to become the most powerful woman any of them would ever know. A lesser soul would have repaid every cruelty with interest, and the village would have called it justice. Adaize did not. She crossed the silent courtyard to her aunt and her cousin, and she took their cold hands in her warm ones, and she told them, gently, that they were still her family, and that there was room enough in her new life for them too if they wished it, and that she forgave them. She asked Obinna for only one thing on her wedding day, that no one in that compound should go hungry while she had bread, not even those who had let her starve. The cruelty in that courtyard did not get the punishment of the cane it had used on her. It got the worse and better punishment of being shown a mercy it had never once shown her in front of everyone, and having to live the rest of its days remembering the difference. They were married that same day, beneath the canopy that had been raised for another, and Adaize put off the faded wrapper at last. The household that had dressed Chinyere now dressed Adaize, and she came back to the courtyard transformed. In a jewel-tone coral bead bridal set and a gold-threaded blouse, gold at her ears and her wrists, her dark hair lifted and crowned, and the crowd that had mocked her drew its breath. Because the dry stick they had pitied was, when given one good day and one good cloth, the most radiant bride that village had ever seen. She stood beside her chief, and the elders blessed them, and the drums did not stop until the stars came out. The life that opened for Adaize after that day was as wide as the one she had left was narrow. The white vehicle that had startled the whole village carried her to the Okonkwo estate, 3 valleys over, a great whitewashed mansion with tall columns and carved doors and gardens that did not end. And there she became its mistress. She who had scrubbed clay floors on her knees now walked across cool marble. She who had slept on a thin mat in a back room now woke in a high, bright chamber with the morning coming gold through the curtains. And on the evenings when the household gathered, she would descend the grand staircase of that house in a floor-length, deep crimson-red sequin gown that caught every light in the room, gold at her ears and her wrist. And the servants and the elders would look up at her coming down and see. Not a girl playing at being rich, but a woman the wealth had simply caught up to at last. But the glow-up that mattered most was the one that did not change. Adaize came into that great house, and she did not become hard, and she did not become proud, and she did not for a single day, forget the bottom of the trunk and the empty place where a dress had been. She kept the same gentle voice she had used on a dying stranger in the rain. She learned the names of every worker on the estate and asked after their children. When the poor came to the gate of the Okonkwo mansion, as the poor had once come to the back gate of her aunt's compound, she did not send them to a servant. She went herself. She would kneel in her fine gown at the great iron gate and press food and clothing into the hands of a hungry child with the same hands that had once held out a bowl in the rain. And she asked nothing for it, and she counted it the truest wealth she owned. The village had complained in the old days that a woman who married up would forget where she came from. Adadeze never gave them the satisfaction. She remembered everything. That was the whole of her power. She sent for her brother first. Little Chukwudi, the boy whose fever had cost her the dress, came to live on the estate and was put into the good school in the town. And he grew up strong and well-fed and clever. And he never wanted for anything again, because his sister had once sold the only fine thing she owned to keep him in the world. And in time, Adeze sent for her aunt and her cousin too, exactly as she had promised in the courtyard, and gave them a place and a share, and her continued forgiveness, and asked nothing of them, but that they be gentler with the next poor soul who came to their gate than they had been with her. Mama Nkechi, who had cursed and schemed and mocked, lived out her days in the shadow of the niece she had despised, fed by her, housed by her. And there is no record that she ever fully understood the mercy she was shown, only that she received it. Chinyere, who was younger and not yet wholly lost, came in time to something like shame and something like change, and learned at last from her cousin's example what her mother had never taught her, which was that the proud are emptied and the humble are filled, and that this is not the world's cruelty, but its deepest justice. And Obinna, the chief who had walked the roads in rags to find a heart that did not want his money, never once regretted the 11 gates that turned him away, because the 11 had led him to the one. He had set out to learn whether kindness still lived in any house that did not first ask what he was worth. And he had found his answer kneeling in the rain in a faded marigold wrapper, holding out a bowl of food while her whole family laughed. He had married it. And the two of them, the chief and the seamstress, the crown and the cloth, made of that great estate a house where no one was ever turned from the gate hungry again, in memory of the night that one nearly was. Wherever you are watching from tonight, in the deep heart of Africa or far across the water in the cold cities of the diaspora, in the south or the islands, or anywhere a good soul has ever been written off and made to feel like nothing, leave it in the comments. Because this story belongs to every one of you who has ever given away your last and trusted that it was not wasted. There is a thing the elders of that village began to say in the years that followed, when they told this story to their children by lamplight. And it is the thing this whole story was bending toward from the first bowl of food in the rain. They said that you can never tell, by the rags a stranger wears, what hand God has hidden inside them, and that the mercy you show the lowest person at your gate may be the very door through which your whole life walks in. They said it because they had watched it happen. A girl gave away her last dress to feed a man the world had thrown away, and the man she fed turned out to be carrying her crown. On the mantel of the great house, under a small pane of glass in a carved wooden frame, the marigold dress hangs to this day. The cloth she sewed by lamplight and sold in the market for a sick boy's life, kept now beside the red coral beads of the chief who bought it back. The humble cloth and the crown rest side by side, and neither one is ashamed of the other, because in that house they have never forgotten which one came first. On the quiet evenings, when the sun goes down gold over the gardens and the lamps come up inside, A daze still stops sometimes before that frame on her way through the room. She is 24 still in the part of the story that matters. The girl who knelt in the rain, even now that she is the mistress of all of it. She rests her fingers a moment on the glass over the folded dress. The one good thing she once owned. The one good thing that bought her everything. And then she goes to the gate to see who has come. Because someone is always coming, and there is always bread. So here is the question I will leave you with tonight. If a starving stranger had fallen at your gate while your whole family stood laughing, would you have closed the door and kept your last good thing safe in its trunk where it could not be lost? Or would you have done what a daze did and given it away and trusted that no kindness is ever truly wasted? Sit with that one and tell me honestly which one you would have been.